A good portion of this class will be dedicated to understanding animal behavior, animal intelligence, animal cognition, but also how animals are used in laboratories to study and understand mechanisms of learning and memory. So there are different approaches to studying animal behavior that we should discuss before moving on to a more psychologically focused approach. So there's the biological approach. Sometimes we call this a naturalistic approach. And this approach is about what that behavior tells us about evolution. How did evolution and adaptation shape that animal to show those kinds of behaviors? We look at very specific behaviors for each animal. This might be migrating patterns or mating patterns, but it might be also how evolution and genetics has shaped the animal's learning. So a psychological approach, well, this is the learning approach that we're going to focus on in this class. So again, we'll talk about unconscious memories and associations, but it also can tell us a little bit about how animals change their behavior with experience during their lifetime. This might be a cognitive approach, and so we might get into declarative memories or decision making in animals. And then there's something of more of a neurological approach, and this has gained a lot of attention in the past half century, looking at how the nervous system changes with learning. And we can use animal models to understand the very mechanisms of learning at the chemical level, at the synaptic level, at the neuronal level. We're going to deal with all of these in this class, though we'll tend to focus on psychology a bit more. We'll talk about this field a little bit more. There's a subfield in psychology called comparative psychology. And for a long time, I would consider myself a comparative psychologist. This is the study of the behavior and mental life of animals, but it looks at different animals and how they solve problems, learn, make choices, make decisions in different species. So in my career, I've studied honeybees and fish and grasshoppers and dogs and even people, comparing to people. Humans are animals too. Within comparative psychology, there might be a field called comparative cognition, which is looking at maybe animal language research, animal decision making, some of these higher processes, higher cognitive processes. And we'll look at that a little bit towards the end of the semester. So comparative psychology, sometimes animal psychology, looks at a variety of animals and how they might solve the same or similar problems. So a biological approach, they tend to be out in the field. They tend not to manipulate the animal's behavior, but this is not always the case. They might look at naturalistic behaviors and track the animals, observe the animals in the wild, put maybe tracking devices on them and look at migratory patterns. Maybe they're filming out in the wild and looking for natural behaviors. A psychological approach tends to bring the animals into a lab. That said, I worked in a zoology department at Oxford University. We were very interested in a biological evolutionary approach, but we still brought the animals into the lab to do some research. So we might use words like innate behavior. When we talk about innate, we're talking about an animal that's born with these behaviors or genetic influences on behavior. So evolution had shaped this animal so when it comes to the world, it has these behaviors, even complex behaviors, already part of its behavioral repertoire. So we look at genetics, genetic influences. It might also be a genetic predisposition to change its behaviors in these ways. We also might think of innate releasing mechanisms, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Certain environmental stimuli that initiate these innate behaviors. Now, we'll call this a sign stimulus. That's the term that we use in biology, sign stimulus as singular or stimuli as plural. These are stimuli that automatically promote specific behaviors. I'm going to give you some very specific examples, but we need to keep these things in mind when we do research on animals from a psychological perspective, because the animal is still bringing with it its biological predispositions. Then we might have reflexes. These are just elicited behaviors. We have a lot of reflexes in our body. Little babies are checked for reflexes when they're first born, whether the eyes react to light, whether they turn their head when you touch them on the cheek, all these types of things. So I'm going to use this word, ethology. We're not going to use it much in this class, but I kind of used to be an ethologist too. This is back when I worked on my degrees in biology. Ethology is the study of behavior, looking at natural behavior, genetically influenced behavior. How does that animal evolve to show behavior specific to its niche or its environment? How did evolution play a role? These might look at species-specific behaviors. Less interested in how the animal changes its behavior with experience, how it learns during its own lifetime, and a little bit more about natural, genetically influenced innate behaviors. And so this might, again, look at migratory pattern behaviors in whales, for example, from Alaska down to Mexico. Or this might look at very specific dancing behavior, mating, courting behavior you see oftentimes in birds, right? You don't see this type of behavior in other animals, but these very specific types of birds show some dancing behaviors. Might be also how animals make decisions when they're foraging to get the maximum food that they can get in their foraging behaviors. So ethology is usually something that a biologist interested in animal behavior would study, ethology. So reflexive behaviors, these are innate behaviors reflexive to certain stimuli. You get your reflexes checked at the doctors. They tap just below your knee at the patella tendon and see your foot come out a little bit with a reflex. Now, humans are kind of unique in that we don't have a really strong set of very complex reflexes. We're actually born with a very underdeveloped brain, which is great for us because it enables us to change the brain a lot with experience. But other animals, they have to be able to do complex behaviors from the time they're born. So let's look at some categories of reflexive behaviors. One is called kinesis. These are random increases or decreases in movement to specific conditions. So let's take example of this little actually is a crustacean, a microcrustacean. It's called a pillbug sometimes. That's a really interesting scientific name. Armadillidius vulgaris. It's a little armadillo. You've seen these things, they crawl around. But these will just show these behaviors that if it is in an area that's too warm, it begins moving. Kinesis, movement, until it finds a place that's cooler, then it stops. It needs a certain amount of moisture. So if it's in an area that doesn't have enough moisture, that will initiate a reflex for movement. And it will move and move and move until it finds a place that is more suited for the environment it wants. Doesn't take a lot of thinking. It moves when it needs to and it stops when it's satisfied. Then we have what's called taxis. Now, taxis is a movement that has a specific direction related to a stimulus or a condition. So, phototaxic, animals move either towards or away from light. We've seen this, you've seen this with moths, even honeybees do this. They move towards the light, and other animals might move away. It's just, a taxis is to or from a very specific thing. It's not just movement, it's moved towards or away. Thigmotaxic, that's a fun word, thigmotaxic. This is movement towards a stationary object. So rodents like mice and rats, They do not like being out in the open. They're very vulnerable in the open. Something swoops down and eats them. So they want to move towards a stationary object, the side of a wall, a rock, a tree. So if you put a little mouse in the middle of a room, an empty room, it would immediately move to the wall and then move along the wall. Thigmotaxic means move towards a stationary object. Again, not a lot of learning here. These are innate tendencies in these animals. There's also what's called a fixed action pattern. This is where a very specific stimulus initiates innately, automatically, a behavior. Sometimes that behavior can be very complex. So, for example, a little baby turtle comes out of the egg, it's deep in the sand, it crawls to the surface, and it moves towards the water. It oftentimes uses the light from the moon reflected off the water, and it moves towards that. The water and the light on the water is a stimulus that causes this fixed pattern. The animal didn't learn anything, didn't go through all these processes. It came to the world moving towards this light. Okay? And that fixed action pattern causes that behavior. We see fixed action patterns create very complex behaviors, like creating a spider web. Let's give an example that's often used with fixed action pattern, and that is a seagull. Now, if you look here, this is a female seagull. I know it's female because it has a little red dot here on the beak. That's a stimulus for an animal. So what we find is that a baby chick seagull will peck at this automatically. Doesn't need to learn about it, doesn't need to get rewarded for it, comes to the world doing it. The stimulus, the sign stimulus, is the red dot, and the fixed action pattern is pecking it. Why? Because when it does, the seagull regurgitates some food for the animal. And there was an interesting study. Well, what is it about the stimulus, the sign stimulus, that creates pecking behavior? So they looked at the pecking rate of little baby chicks, and they used not an actual seagull, but a little model of a seagull. So they had a model that looked just like a seagull's beak, and they moved it back and forth, and they got this pretty good pecking. They used a standard model. Didn't look naturalistic at all. It was just kind of the shape of a head with a red dot, and it produced some good pecking. And then they just took the head off and just moved the yellow beak with the red dot back and forth, just the bill, and we get pecking. So it's not the whole face, it's not the whole head, it's just this red dot. Well, maybe it's just red. So they took a little stick, didn't look anything like a seagull's head, and they just moved it back and forth. It was just red and yellow, and that got the most pecking behavior. So in this case, what is the sign stimulus? It's red movement. And what's the fixed action pattern? Pecking. The animal didn't need to learn to do this. It came to the world with this innate behavior. We need to take into account the fact that stimuli that we use in laboratories to do research on learning may produce innate responses that might confound the way we interpret learned behavior. Here's another example. So here is a stickleback fish, and the males will be aggressive toward other males. The male produces this red underbelly, and that causes aggression and causes fighting. The red underbelly is the sign stimulus. The aggression and attacking is the fixed action pattern. Why? Because they're competing for mates, okay? And the gray underside of a female will produce courting behavior in stickleback fish. So bring this into a laboratory, get a bunch of stickleback, get some male stickleback, and simply show them a oval with red on the bottom. What do you think the male does? It attacks this. Why? Because the red underbelly is a sign stimulus, produces an innate response of aggression. Show a male a oval with gray on the bottom, and you see behavior that represents courting behavior, right? The sign stimulus is the gray, and the fixed action pattern is courting behavior. Animals don't need to learn it. These stimuli just produce those complex behaviors. One of my favorite examples is an animal that's called a brood parasite. Brood parasite. This is a bird, and there are several types of them, cowbirds, cuckoo birds, that come along and lay their egg in another bird's nest and then take off. And this egg hatches more quickly than the natural bird's eggs. And this little bird hatches with some very complex innate behaviors. So when this baby cowbird hatches, it kicks the other eggs out of the nest automatically, innately. It didn't learn anything. It didn't go through a process of gaining information. It came to the world with a very complex behavior innately. The sign stimulus was the other eggs. The fixed action pattern was to scoot it out of the nest. That's a really complex behavior. We see this continue because the bird that is being parasitized, I think that in this case a warbler, will see a gaping mouth of the brood parasite of the cowbird, just a gaping mouth. That's a stimulus, a sign stimulus. What does she do? She sticks food into it. Open mouth, stick food into it automatically, right? And so the brood parasite can't learn from its mom about how to do these complex behaviors because it doesn't ever see its mom. It's raised by another species, but it has these complex behaviors that make it survive. We use a lot of these stimuli in animals and in people. We have these natural behaviors, natural emotional expressions, innate. If you saw a dog, you came up to a dog and it looks like this, what do? Do you go and rub its belly? You go, who's a good dog? No, of course not. You can detect the ears are forward, haunches up, tails out straight. That dog is dangerous. That dog is showing aggression. That's a stimulus that other animals understand. What about this one? There's a submissive dog. There's a good boy, right? You don't have a problem walking up to this dog, scratching it on its butt. This is showing submission. Other animals get this. What do I mean by other animals? It doesn't have to be other dogs. It could be other canines, or it could be completely different species. Let me show you an example. Up in Alaska, polar bears will sometimes attack and kill a husky dog, a sled dog. But sometimes they get together and play. These animals like to play. Dogs like to play. Polar bears like to play. So they come up to each other and they give each other these stimuli signs of body posture. And they say, I'm in the mood for playing. And they play with each other. Let's look at a video.
Two natural predators in empathy. How is it that Brian's dogs and these bears seem to have reached such a remarkable understanding?
I can't say I know all the answers. I just know that when there's a bad relationship, the other dogs know it and we move it out. But if the relationships are casual and they're very exploratory. The bears are social, very individualistic, but they have a social adaptability. This is a social order here. It's a social thing, and they're sort of enjoying it.
So, again, these stimuli produce either aggression or play. So they tell each other information that is automatic and innate. I see by your posture that you do not want to fight. You do not want to eat me. You want to play, right? This doesn't have to be at a conscious level. This is unconscious, innate, right? So in this case, husky dog might come up like this And the bear said, oh, I see you're submissive and you want to play. And the polar bear does the same thing, and they communicate back and forth. Everything good? Good. Let's have a good roll around and some wrestle. We have innate behaviors too. We have innate expressions. Some of our expressions that we show for happiness or anger or fear can be universal. In other words, can be found in many different cultures that have been separated for a long time. Finally, we get into a specific type of innate behavior. I'm going to give you one example, and this is called imprinting. Imprinting was first described by Nobel laureate named Konrad Lorenz, and another researcher named Tinbergen won a Nobel Prize in medicine for their work on animal behavior. And what Lorenz said was that there's a critical window of opportunity when a little bird, like a geese, when they hatch or duck, the first couple things they see that is moving around, that's that opportunity to say, oh, you must be my mom. Innately. Doesn't have to be conscious. It's just, that's who I will attach to. Imprinting is when an animal connects with another animal, usually, almost always, its mother, and follows that animal around. It imprints on it. And there's supposed to be this sort of window time where the animal does that. And imprinting was taken and used by this artist and a pilot named William Leishman up in Canada. And he liked to fly ultralights. And he had some geese imprint on him, right? The mother died, and suddenly he's got geese following around. They're Canadian geese. And he's like, I think I need to teach these animals. They have to learn how to migrate and where to migrate. So he had them imprint on him and then imprint on this ultralight glider. And then they followed him to the place down in South America where they would migrate to. It was even the basis of a movie with Jeff Daniels and Anna Paquin called Fly Away Home. I highly recommend it. It's a really good movie. But let's take a look at how he did this. So the geese would imprint on them, follow him around, and then he would slowly train them to follow the ultralight. Let's have a look.
It's such an incredible story that Hollywood told it. In this movie, Fly Away Home, it's based on the work of a Canadian team that teaches geese to follow an ultralight airplane and eventually follow new and safer migratory routes. The movie's now come and gone from theaters, but the work continues. The team, called Operation Migration, has been so successful with geese, it now hopes to use ultralights to train different birds and save them from the verge of extinction. The process is long and hard and full of setbacks. Over the next month, we'll be bringing you a number of stories as we check in with Operation Migration.
So they're using imprinting. In other words, a geese says, okay, that's the mother figure. I'll follow that around. They've been using this to teach other migratory birds how to migrate. They do this in France. They do this in Canada. It's really quite interesting. But again, it's innate. It's genetic. But it also requires stimuli. In this case, a mother figure, a moving mother figure. If the mother's there, which the mother typically is, the geese follow the mother, everything's fine. But if something happens to the mother or the mother's taken away, then they will imprint on something else that's moving around. All right, so we need to keep in mind as we go forward and talk as psychologists about learning and about memory, we need to always keep in mind the behaviors we see may have an innate component and not necessarily a learning component.